start. Hey, well, hello and welcome back to the 4 books of Confucian learning. Now, last week we got to know a little bit about Mencius, the philosopher, Mencius, the text, and we started reading the first few passages from its opening chapter. And if you can remember, those passages were largely about leadership and bringing about order to the life of the state. But as you might also remember, Mencius's words were hugely applicable to bringing about order to the life of the individual as well, ordinary individuals. We don't have to be state rulers to benefit from reading Mencius. And in fact, most readers of the Mencius were not state rulers over the centuries. Now, one of the ways that we benefit from this text is through the historical figures that we come across. Take, for example, use the heroes. If you remember King Hui of Liang, and he was in the very opening passage. He's a classic example of the fact that these historical figures that we come across in the text, they resonate with the personalities or the human tendencies that we still have to deal with in our life and work today. Now, King Hui of Liang, what does he say to Mencius when Mencius arrives? The first question that he asks Mencius, surely you have some means to benefit our state. He's really upfront, what's in it for me and my state, you're coming here. Later on, in another passage, we find that, he thinks that he's to serve the people in his state. And he compares himself with the contemporary rulers of other states at the time, and he thinks, he's really the best. So the timeless excuse for complacency, you're comparing yourself to people who are even worse. They might not provide this famine relief that he points out to Mencius that he does for his people. Now, in particular, there's an exemplar that I have in mind. If you remember King Wen and his imperial park. Now, King Wen and his imperial park we've heard previously in relation to the other books, of the 4 books, that, as a prince, he cared very much about his father, the king at the time. And, with this imperial park, we can see that he shares the park with the people and obviously takes great care of all of the creatures in the park, from the birds in the air to the fishes in the waters below. And, I think when I read this that, how could one person be so benevolent to so many? But if you think about it, if in our day-to-day life, if we choose to reuse a cardboard box, or it could be reusing an old envelope as notepaper. We do this day in, day out, and over the course of our lives, it all adds up to maybe trees, countless trees even. And if you really think about it, each tree is a whole universe of living organisms, from the birds and monkeys above to the squirrels and the insects below. So, King Wen shows us that it is humanly possible to practice this heart of benevolence or humanity. And the good news is that Mencius tells us in this text that we have the same nature, this innate goodness as King Wen. It's no different. Now, King Wen is upheld as a sage in all of the 4 books. And we can be sages too, as long as if we put our minds to it. And we're going to go into this today. We're going to explore Mencius's ideas on human nature. Now, Mencius stands out for being the first Chinese thinker to advocate that human nature is innately good. This was a bit of a development from Confucius's position that human natures were inherently similar. So all human beings, their inherent nature is similar, is what Confucius taught. And Mencius sort of went a little bit further. He said that actually human nature is innately good. Now, this was a response to the times that he lived in. If you can remember, Mencius lived in what was called the Warring States period. And during this period of time, there were many alternative and competing theories out there, and certainly many opponents of Confucian thought. Now, these opponents included the followers of Mo Di, or Master Mo. They're called Moists, and the followers of Yang Zhu, who I've also listed here. Now, the followers of Master Mo, well, Master Mo advocated that we should show equal care for everyone. So they particularly objected to the Confucian idea that our moral senses developed, first within the family, and then we extend our care beyond the family, but certainly remain partial to our family members. Now, they objected to this because they believed that we should love and care for everyone equally. They had this idea of inclusive, universal love. At the other end of the spectrum, you could say the followers of Yang Zhu, who advocated that actually the proper goal of human life is to care for just oneself. If they could exert, minimum effort that could benefit the whole world, well, they still wouldn't do that. They considered that there was, absolutely no personal satisfaction to be gained from social participation. They were just concerned about looking after themselves, living out their natural years. So that gives you a flavour of the sort of range of ideas that were out there. Different theorists, different thinkers put forward their different ideas. And Mencius, who lived around that time, had to defend Confucius's teachings. And in doing so, he developed them as well. So Mencius argued that human beings are by their nature inclined towards goodness. And if by according to this, with this inclination, we develop into full moral beings so that we can bring the most benefit to both our family and society. So this goodness is characterized by a limitless potential to bring out moral excellence in ourselves and in others. But, people often wonder, does everyone really have this innate potential for moral goodness? Some people will question if everyone, human beings are innately good, or why does it seem that some people are not good? Why would we want to realize our innate potential for goodness? So these are all very interesting questions. They're certainly big questions. And in the 10 passages that we'll look at today, Mencius helps us think about, our innate goodness, and also understand more about the way we think, human nature, and how we go about really developing or cultivating the goodness that is innate to us all. So in this first passage, Mencius highlights that all human beings have a heart that is sensitive to the suffering of others. So this is a starting point. And he even provides a historical application of such sensitivity. So Mencius said, no person is without a heart that is sensitive to the suffering of others. And if you can understand the Chinese term, literally, if we were to translate it literally, it means a heart that cannot bear the suffering of others. Such a sensitive heart was possessed by the former kings, and this manifested itself in compassionate government. Administering compassionate government with such a sensitive heart, ruling the empire was as easy as turning something around on one's palm. So Mencius is saying that having a sensitive heart towards others was the key to how the sagely rulers of the past, how they achieved good government. And they simply applied or extended their, compassionate heart to the welfare of the people. They used their sensitivity to implement compassionate government and brought about order to the empire, as though carrying it within their hand. Now, the possibility of bringing about order, to the state sounds pretty appealing. It can be as instinctive and as easy as this. Well, how do we really know that everyone has such a sensitive heart, a compassionate heart? Well, Mencius explains using a well-known thought experiment. He said, why is a heart sensitive to the suffering of others is this. Suppose a person suddenly saw a young child about to fall into a well. Anyone would have a heart of alarm and compassion, not because they wanted to get into the good graces of the child's parents, nor because they wished to win the praise of their neighbours and friends, nor because they disliked the cry of the child. From this, it can be seen that lacking the heart of compassion and commiseration is not human. Lacking the heart of shame and aversion is not human. Lacking the heart of declining and yielding is not human. And lacking the heart of affirming and negating is not human. So the idea here is that anyone who suddenly sees a helpless child, in such danger, well, they would react with a heart of alarm and compassion. They would instinctively feel concerned about the child. Now, this reaction arises spontaneously, and it's certainly not, based on a self-interested calculation. Now, Mencius is making a claim here about the way that all people would react to the situation. It's not saying about, arguing about what specific action that they would take, but everyone and anyone would have this instinctive, spontaneous reaction to seeing a child in danger. Now, you might think, well, actually open wells are quite rare, depends on where you live, really. But I'm sure we can all imagine the alarm that we would feel if we were to see an oblivious child chasing a ball towards a busy road. So it happens immediately, and the situation sort of seizes us. Now, Mencius would draw our attention to this spontaneous reaction inside of us. And from this spontaneous reaction, we're able to know that, well, yes, all people possess a heart that is sensitive to the suffering of others. Okay, other people not even related to the child. I might not know the child at all. So at the core of Mencius's theory of human nature is the idea of the innate moral inclination of this human nature and its moral qualities. So what sort of moral qualities are innate to us all? Mencius explains. The heart of compassion and commiseration is a sprout of humanity. The heart of shame and aversion is the sprout of rightness. The heart of declining and yielding is the sprout of propriety, and the heart of affirming and negating is the sprout of wisdom. The person has these 4 sprouts as they have 4 limbs. Now, as we said, Mencius is known for his theory that humans are by nature innately good. And what he means is not that all people are necessarily good, nor that we're all born good, but that we all have the capacity to become good. So the key word here is the capacity. And, that's because we all have spontaneous ways of reacting to the world that naturally lead toward virtue under the right conditions. Now, Mencius calls such capacities or dispositions, these are dispositions for becoming good, he calls them moral sprouts or sprouts of virtue. And, it's quite interesting because he identifies these 4 sprouts in particular, and they sort of are there to represent the beginnings of altruistic feeling and caring disposition. Now, if we look at the Chinese character for the word sprout, it's actually made up of character in the, next to sprout. On the left is the component. It's actually a character in itself, and it means to stand up or to establish. And it literally depicts a person. You can see sort of a stick figure standing on top of the line. And that line could be the ground or it could be a table, just standing on top of something, because it's sort of there to signify the idea of to stand up, to establish. Now, on the right-hand side of the character of sprout is an image of a sprout. It depicts the initial stage of growth in the life of a plant, where you can see it's sort of just sprouting up above the soil level, the ground, as indicated by the horizontal line. And you can see its roots, starting to extend outwards below. So wrapped up in this one character is the idea of the beginning or the tip of something. And certainly when Mencius identifies his sprouts of virtue, there's certainly the beginnings of these altruistic feelings, caring and dispositions. Now, before I read more about Mencius's arguments on human nature, I think it might be a little bit helpful if we're a little bit clearer about what sort of what these moral sprouts entail. So if we look at the first one, the heart of compassion and commiseration. This is a sprout of humanity. Now, if you can remember humanity, we talked about the sensitive, being sensitive to the suffering of others. It sort of centers on care and compassion. Now, later Confucians actually associated this humanity with the sensitivity to the suffering in the world. And they compared the way that we feel pain in our own body to the way that we should feel pain, the pain that is experienced by others. Now, in fact, the Chinese word for the opposite of humanity, inhumane, actually means to be insensitive, unfeeling. And it's become a medical term for numbness or paralysis. Now, we find some examples of this heart of compassion and commiseration being the beginnings of humanity in a passage from the very first chapter of Mencius. And it's actually part of a very long dialogue between Mencius and King Xuan of the state of Qi. And this king was one of the most powerful rulers of the time. Now, the background to this story, the king had asked Mencius, whether it was possible for someone like him to maintain and protect the people. And Mencius said, yes, Well, the king was interested. Well, how do you know this, Mencius? How do you know that I'm capable of doing this? And Mencius replies. He said, I heard from your attendant. The attendant said to Mencius the following. The king sat aloft in his hall when someone led an ox past below it. The king saw it and said, Where is the ox going? And the man replied, It will be used to consecrate a bell. The king said, Let it go. I cannot bear its terrified appearance. It's like an innocent person being taken for execution. The man responded, Then should we abandon the consecration of the bell? The king said, How can that be abandoned? Use a sheep instead. And Mencius wanted to confirm with the king, I don't know if this incident actually happened. And the king said, Yes, it did. Well, Mencius for being a true king. The people all took your majesty as being stingy about the ox because, he simply replaced the ox with a smaller animal, the sheep. But Mencius says, I know for sure that it was your majesty's not being able to bear it. But Mencius tries to probe further. If your concern was that, the animal was being executed despite its innocence, what difference is there in choosing between the ox and the sheep? Both would be equally innocent. I'm sure equally scared as well. And the king sort of thinks about it, and he really doesn't know, what he had in mind, why he decided to use the sheep instead of the ox. Well, Mencius replies, tries to help the king think it through and rationalize. He says, well, this is actually the method of humanity. You saw the ox, but you hadn't seen the sheep. Now, the exemplary person, noble, relate to birds and beasts such that seeing them alive, they cannot bear to see them die. Hearing their cries, they cannot bear to eat their flesh, and therefore the noble keep far from the kitchen. So, this account about, how the king reacted and the conclusions that Mencius draws from his observations. This account illustrates that the sprout of humanity can be seen through the heart of compassion and commiseration, as described in terms of being sensitive to the suffering of others, finding it simply unbearable. And this feeling concern appears in three instances. There was the king's feeling for the ox about to be sacrificed. So the ox was, terrified. There's also the instance of his thought about how an innocent person, how he would feel on seeing an innocent person being taken away to be executed. That's a second example. And finally, the hypothetical that Mencius puts forward, how the noble the sympathy that the noble would feel for an animal being slaughtered. So all of those feelings are spontaneous reactions to the world around us. And remember, they're just the beginnings. These are just the sprouts of humanity, but they're the spontaneous reactions that confirm that we have, the beginnings of humanity within us all. So Mencius sort of tells the king that, if he can feel concern enough to save the ox, well, he can certainly do the same for his people. It's just a matter of whether he's willing to go to do so. According to Mencius, our concern naturally extends beyond our circle of family and friends. We care about the child about to fall into the well. They're not a relative. And we can see that, there's concern for an ox, not of the same species. So this explanation of humanity arising from feelings, strangers, and even animals. This is another of Mencius's innovations, how he developed Confucius's teachings. And it's thought that this is probably a response to the Maoist criticism of Confucian care not being inclusive enough. So Mencius sort of makes this point that, look, we understand that human beings are concerned about other animals, strangers as well. Okay, so this is the sprout of humanity. It comes from the heart of compassion and commiseration. The next sprout is the sprout of rightness that arises from the heart of shame and aversion. Now, rightness is about appropriate conduct, performing the right actions in the given circumstances. But it's described as the heart of shame and aversion. So it derives from the spontaneous feelings of being ashamed of wrongful conduct or feeling averse to, being disgusted by misconduct. And I think it's well expressed in a line that we've read from The Highest Learning. I'm sure we'll remember. It goes like this: making not deceiving oneself, like disliking an offensive smell or liking a beautiful sight. And the point is that we should be attracted to, moral conduct in the same visceral way that we're spontaneously drawn to a beautiful view. And by the same token, we should react to misconduct with immediate repulsion that we would have towards a bad smell. So the sprout of rightness derives from our feelings of shame and aversion towards wrongful behavior. It is, after all, the sprout of rightness. The next sprout is the sprout of propriety. Described here as part of declining and yielding. And these terms were traditionally, they referred to different things. Declining referred to declining, for example, resigning from a position in a corrupt government. And yielding, it means to give up something. So we might give something up out of respect, say, for our parents or other elders. But it's interesting that later on in a subsequent passage, that also provides a list of these moral sprouts. The sprout of propriety is the only one that is described a bit differently. It's described as the heart of respect and reverence. But, we can certainly see the overlap where we might, for example, let someone have something that we would otherwise want for ourselves out of respect for the other person. So there's no real inconsistency. So if we can understand that the sprout of propriety derives from the heart of declining and yielding, and to give some examples from daily life, it's we can tell we have these spontaneous feelings when we, without even having to think twice, we hold the door open to, for somebody else. We might give up our seat on public transport, or we wait to speak so we don't interrupt somebody else. Those are just day-to-day examples that would be evidence of this heart of declining, yielding to others, which is the sprout of propriety. Okay, moving along. Last but not least is the sprout of wisdom, and it comes from the heart of affirming and negating. What does that mean? Well, it derives from human desire to learn. We have this curiosity to learn about the world around us and to make sense of the world that we live in. And it naturally leads to the accumulation of knowledge and, some judgment, discernment. That is wisdom. Now, I think Franklin Perkins puts it well when he says Mencius's point is that we're naturally drawn to sort and evaluate things. He's writing about the sprout of wisdom. And human beings are born with the desire to learn, as we see in a child's unending curiosity. Why is this and why is that? It's not just that this curiosity is a prerequisite for wisdom, but it counts as evidence of the sprout of wisdom because it leads towards wisdom by its own internal force. As I mentioned before, this curiosity, desire to learn, it sort of that's how we accumulate knowledge about the world around us, and through that knowledge, judgment. So that's the sprout of wisdom. And basically, these 4 virtues, as I keep mentioning, that they're spontaneous. They're also complementary and interdependent. So to give an example, a virtuous person would express their care and concern. That would be the sprout of humanity. Through the care and concern, through appropriate conduct, which is the sprout of rightness, using the correct manners, and that's a sprout of propriety, and taking into account, the changing circumstances, which involves, having that good judgment, which is evidence of the sprout of wisdom. So Mencius tells us that these 4 sprouts are as fundamental to the human constitution as arms and legs. And no one can claim that they lack these 4 sprouts because it's something that everyone is born with. Now, Mencius tells us to have these 4 sprouts and say that you cannot, develop them is to rob oneself. To say that your sovereign cannot do so is to rob your sovereign. Everyone has these 4 sprouts within them, and knowing how to extend them and fulfill them, they'll be like a fire beginning to ignite or spring beginning to flow. They can extend on their own power. And if you fulfill them, they're enough to stabilize all within the 4 seas and bring order to the whole empire. If you fail to fulfill them, then they're not enough to serve your father and mother. What does that mean? Well, to have these 4 sprouts and claim that we're not capable of developing our, this innate goodness and strive towards moral excellence, well, that's really preventing oneself from realizing our innate potential for goodness. Deny that a ruler can do the same and therefore not correct them or advise them is to prevent the ruler from improving their ethical character. So you're robbing them, or robbing oneself and robbing the sovereign of this opportunity to realize their innate potential for moral goodness. Now, our moral sprouts extend under their own power, like spreading fire or a flowing spring. Now, this passage tells us why we should care about realizing this innate potential for goodness. If our moral sprouts are developed, they lead towards a concern for the whole world, and we're able to serve and bring benefit to all the world. But if our moral sprouts are left undeveloped, well, even our own family will be neglected because we won't be able to properly care for them. Even those closest to us, we won't be able to practice family reverence towards our parents or fraternal respect among our siblings. Now, this passage is, you could say that it's iconic. You haven't read the Mencius until you've read this passage. And it's really notable that these 4 sprouts, we encounter them again. They're reiterated in a later passage, as I mentioned before. And we'll have a look at this now. That you find that it's actually reiterated with very minor variations. So this passage comes from the first part of chapter 6 and basically underscores Mencius's theory that human nature is innately good. It restates the 4 sprouts in a conversation between Mencius and his student. His student is called Gong Duozi. Mencius said, one's natural tendencies enable oneself to do good. And that is what I mean by human nature being good. When one does what is not good, it's not the fault of one's capacities. Now, every person has the heart of compassion, commiseration, the heart of shame and aversion, the heart of respect and reverence, and the heart of affirming and negating. So, keep going. Compassion, commiseration is humanity. The heart of shame and aversion is rightness. The heart of respect and reverence is propriety. And the heart of affirming and negating is wisdom. Humanity, rightness, propriety, and wisdom are not fused onto us from the outside. We possess them inherently. It's just that we do not think about them. So it is said, seek and you attain it. Let go and you will lose it. That some differ from others by as much as twice or 5 times or countless times is because there are those who are unable to fully develop their capacities. So if everyone has these moral sprouts or ethical beginnings, why does it seem that only some people are good? Or maybe why some people are good for only some of the time? Well, this passage tells us that cultivating our moral sprouts requires conscious effort. I've highlighted, it's just that we don't think about it. It requires conscious effort by the individual, and it's a matter of whether the individual commits to cultivating their moral sprouts. They have to choose to develop these capacities. They're innate, they have to be developed, and they have to work at doing so, work at becoming and achieving this moral excellence. Now, Mencius emphasizes that we're all naturally endowed with the same potential for moral goodness. But sometimes environmental factors get in the way of our realizing this potential. So we have the nature, but it needs the nurture. Have a look at another passage, the next passage. Most of the young people have the wherewithal to be good. In years of famine, most of them become violent. This is not a matter of nature endowing people differently, but rather of what overwhelms their hearts. So when the years of abundance, when harvest has been abundant, people have more than enough to eat and clothe themselves, and they can afford to, show kindness and care for others, to be good, to do good. In times of famine, it can be quite desperate. There's a lot of suffering, and people may resort to robbery. They become violent. Now, it's not that people have naturally endowed with different amounts of virtue. Not at all. But it's just that under adverse conditions, it can be a struggle just to survive, to subsist with any food, any shelter. So people just don't have the time and energy to learn about their moral sprouts and to apply themselves to developing their moral virtue. And that's completely understandable, isn't it? Now, Mencius uses another plant analogy. Here he's talking about barley. He says, let barley be sown and covered with earth. If the soil is the same, the time of planting is also the same, it grows rapidly, and in due course of time, which is usually the summer solstice, it all ripens. Though there might be differences, it's because of the differences in the fertility of the soil, in the nourishment of the rain and dew, the moisture, or in the human efforts. Things of the same kind are thus like one another. And why should we doubt this only when it comes to human beings? The sage and I are the same in kind. So this innate goodness of human nature is here likened to barley seeds. The seeds are all the same, and But Mencius recognizes that there might be better yields where the land might have soil that some parts of the land soil that is more fertile, that happens to be exposed to more moisture, or just better looked after by the farmers. So the difference in the yield of barley, or how much is grown, is analogous to the moral differences in people. And Mencius emphasizes that we have the same innate potential as the sages who have fully developed their moral virtue. We have the same innate goodness as King Wen. There are environmental factors that impact on the development of our moral sprouts. And there are two that Mencius identifies. He says one is what preoccupies our hearts. In the first paragraph, life could simply be such a struggle that we're just preoccupied with staying alive, just subsisting. That's one factor. And the other factor is how much effort we put in to developing our moral sprouts. Or you can imagine it's also a question of how much effort we can put in. So environmental influences count for just as much as human efforts. Now, sometimes those circumstances, it's not that the circumstances deprive people of the time and energy to develop their moral sprouts. It's more a case of the circumstances distracting people completely. Where, for example, a culture might encourage the pursuit of material comforts. And people are so busy enjoying themselves that they might forget about other things in the process, other things like developing their moral sprouts. So, for example, many economic systems around the world generate a culture that encourages people, that constantly draws our attention to new and better things for convenience, more comfort, luxury, and prestige. So people can be distracted and preoccupied with enjoying a life of material comforts, and probably also working very hard to keep up that lifestyle. So we certainly can't underestimate the transformative impact of our environment. Now, Mencius further elaborates on this transformative environmental influence. He does so by reference to Ox Mountain, another very iconic passage. It's a particular mountain in the state of Qi, and it's a state that is quite densely populated. Now, the mountain is located outside of the capital city of the state of Qi. Okay. The trees on Ox Mountain were once beautiful, but being situated on the outskirts of a large state, the trees were cut down by axes. Could they remain beautiful? Given the regenerative nature over time and the moisture of the rain and dew, they did not fail to grow new buds and shoots. But then cattle and sheep came along to graze on. This accounts for the barren appearance of the mountain. Seeing this barrenness, people supposed that the mountain was never wooded, never had trees to begin with. But how could this be the nature of the mountain? So Ox Mountain became deforested. And it was deforested through the activity of the woodcutters and the cattle and the sheep. Even the regenerative nature of an entire mountain was thwarted by external factors, those external factors. And Mencius uses this visible condition of deforestation as an analogy for dehumanization, how a person might lose their humanity. It says, possibly be without the heart of humanity and rightness? Where a person lets go of their good heart, it is like taking an axe to a tree. being cut down day after day, can their heart remain beautiful? Given the regenerative nature over time and the restorative energy of the dawn, their likes and dislikes will still resemble those of other people, but barely so. And then their heart can become shackled and depleted by what they do during the day. And if this shackling occurs repeatedly, well, the effect of the night energy will no longer preserve their heart, and they will be, again, removed from the animals. Seeing this, one might suppose that they never had the capacity for goodness. But can this be the natural tendency of a human being? Now, humanity and rightness, they exist within human beings, just as plants and trees naturally exist on the mountains. And as we know, everyone has the same innate potential for moral goodness, just like the sages. And just as plants and trees have become endangered through the grazing and the wood cutting, well, our humanity and rightness are endangered by the blind pursuit of material gain. And what we do with our time, what we do for a living, day in, day out, they can prevent us from doing good, becoming good and doing good, just like shackles that bind our hands. Now, Mencius concludes that with nourishment, there is nothing that will not grow. Without nourishment, so there is nothing that will not wither. It sounds obvious, but the idea is that, well, there's the potential for the mountain to regenerate given enough time. And when the people stop falling the timber and grazing their animals. Now remember, it's sort of outside the capital city of a very densely populated state. Now, likewise with a person might realize their humanity and rightness and develop their other virtues when they let go of their selfish desires. So yes, there are environmental influences, and Mencius certainly recognizes that, as we saw in the previous passage. But there's an idea here that we as human beings can also step up to take some responsibility, just like Mencius advised King Hui of Liang to take some responsibility. He couldn't just blame the famine for people starving to death in his state. He had to take some responsibility. Was the grains in the granaries and the state granaries being distributed? What else can I do? And we can give ourselves a better chance to strengthen our moral sprouts by ensuring that what we do, including our career, how we spend our time, doesn't go against the grain of our innate ethical character. Now, a common question is, look, everyone is innately good, okay, but why does it seem that only some people are good? Why do some people achieve this moral excellence and others don't? This is answered in the next passage, where Gongruzo mentions the student, asks, we're all human beings, yet some people are great and some people are petty. Why is this? And Mencius replies, well, those who follow the greater part themselves become great people. Those who follow the petty part themselves become petty persons. And Gongruzo, as a student, he thinks, well, we're all human beings. Why do some people follow their greater part, follow their petty part? Why is this difference in choices? Well, Mencius answers the question. He says, look, the faculties of hearing and sight do not think and are obscured by things. So, there are limits to what we can see and hear, or our senses, what our senses can do and perceive. And we think, really? Well, we can imagine that we just need to stand, from a far distance from someone, and we won't be able to see or hear them very clearly. And not to mention having obstacles in the way of our line of sight, or soundproofing, or noisy background. So there are limits to what our senses can perceive. Now, when one thing comes into contact with another, as a matter of course, it leads it away. But the faculty of the heart, the job of the heart is to think, to reflect. And by thinking, it understands. By not thinking, well, and this is what nature has endowed us with, this critical heart. If a person first establishes the greater part of themselves, if they can reflect and choose to follow the greater part of themselves, their heart, then the petty part, is unable to steal it away, distract it. And being the great person, becoming the great person, is no more than this. The key to this achieving moral excellence lies in the central role of our heart. And it's there to think about what we perceive, what our senses perceive, to think about it, to reflect, okay, and obviously be educated as well, to make the right decisions, to want, to nourish and nurture our moral sprouts, and to try to strive for moral excellence. So the commentaries clarify that the greater part of a person's nature is their moral sprouts, like propriety, rightness, humanity, and the smaller part consists of our sensory indulgence. Now, when a person thinks and reflects on what their senses perceive, they're in a better position to prioritize the development of their moral sprouts, and ultimately to become a great person. But the danger is if a person remains unthinking, they're no better than animals, because they simply blindly follow whatever their senses perceive, and these people will never develop the potential for moral greatness. Now, the next passages sort of start to tell us what it takes to cultivate our moral sprouts. Mencius says that the king is unwise. Now, the commentary suggests that while Mencius was serving in the court of the state of T, advising the king, he was probably faulted for not helping the king to improve more. And this passage is thought to be Mencius's response to this criticism. Mencius uses another plant analogy. He says, take something that is the easiest thing in the world to grow. Expose it to the warm sun for 1 day and expose it to the frigid cold for 10 days. It will not be able to grow. I seldom see the king, and when I withdraw, those of the cold arrive. Even if I've caused some buds to appear, what good does it do? So Mencius makes the point that even the plant that is the most easiest to grow would not survive if it had just 1 day of warmth, 1 day of sunlight and warmth, and then 10 days of cold. And Mencius sort of likens his presence to this sunny warmth. That's essential for the growth of a plant. And the presence of the king's other officials is likened to the cold. So Mencius probably had few audiences alone with the king, who is otherwise surrounded by courtiers who were maybe less ethical. They probably flattered the king, indulged him, and just they didn't care whether he wanted to cultivate his ethical character or not. It didn't matter to them. So you just have one Mencius trying to counsel and encourage the king towards goodness, and then let's say 10 other officials. So you have one Mencius, 10 other officials that couldn't care less. Just lets the king do otherwise. And so the odds are clearly against the king becoming wiser or developing their moral virtues and ethical character. And so this sort of resonates with the first passage that we read today. It criticizes the people who effectively rob their sovereign, their ruler, by denying their capacity to become or do good and failing to guide them accordingly. Now, for ourselves, this passage alerts us to the fact that we can't be half-hearted in working and cultivating our moral sprouts. We can't just, do 1 day and then take a break for 10. That's not how we should That's not really the approach that's recommended by Mencius if we really want our sprouts to develop. Now, Mencius goes on to say, take chess. It's a board game, but without concentrating one's heart and exerting mental effort, even chess can't be mastered. Take the finest chess player in the state, and suppose that Ichio, this finest chess player, he teaches 2 students to play chess. One student concentrates their heart, exerts the mental effort, and listens just to Ichio, while the other, although he listens, he thinks that a swan is approaching and imagines grabbing his bow and arrow to shoot at the swan. So although he's studying alongside the other student, he doesn't compare to the other student. So is this because his intelligence is not comparable? Well, Mencius would say no, it's not. To master a board game like chess, we need to focus and concentrate. We need to exert this mental effort. And if we had the best teacher to teach us how to play in 2 equally intelligent students, the person who concentrates on what the teacher says is bound to be better than the student who is distracted. So this passage highlights that a person can be distracted from cultivating their moral sprouts because of the people around them, external, like with the king, but also they can be distracted by their own wandering thoughts and their daydreams. So that can't be blamed on anyone else. And we can imagine that the king of tea can become wise if he just listens to his sagely advisors like Mencius, and stops himself from being distracted by the other people around him. So at the end of the day, a person can choose to associate with people like Mencius, and they can choose to remain focused like that classmate. It does take mental effort. It's not easy, but in making the wrong choices, we just fail to develop our moral spirits. Now, ideally, we should be surrounded by the virtuous people, the positive role models, right? And Mencius compares this moral development to learning a language. He uses the example of someone from the southern state of Chuo wanting their son to learn the language of Qi, which is one of the northern states in northern China, in the north. So the people in the state of Chuo were ethnically distinct from the people in northern China, and they spoke a different native language. So Mencius says, if one person teaches the son, but many people chat around him, though he may be beaten daily to make him speak the language of tea, he will not be able to do so. But if you were to send to live in these areas of tea for several years, though you were to force him to make him speak the language of Chuo, he would also be unable to do so. So this comparing moral development to language acquisition is very interesting because, in learning a language, it requires a shift in the way that we think and speak and move. And this transformation comes about from immersion with speakers of that language, not just a transfer of information. Language teachers call this language acquisition. And that is in contrast to language learning. So our acquisition of virtues, moral virtues, involves a similar change. We have to be prepared to put in the work and make those adjustments. Now, Mencius here talks about a good officer, Xue Zhuzhou, and he's recognized as a good officer. He's placed near the king. But if all the people around the king, they're like this good officer, well, chances are that with whom would the king do anything that is not good? But if the people all around the king, there were no one else like him, then with whom will the king do good? What can one Xue Zhuzhou do for the king of Song? Just like what the one Mencius for the king of Qi. So it reiterates the importance of having these positive virtuous role models and in an environment that is conducive to developing our moral sprouts. just conscious of the time, and I think we might have time just to cover one more passage. Now, this passage alerts us to the importance of priorities. Mencius said, suppose someone whose fourth finger is bent and will not straighten. This doesn't cause pain or hindrance, and yet if there is someone who can straighten the finger, the afflicted person will not consider the road to Ting or Tul too far, because their finger is not like that of other people. If their finger is not like that of others, they know to detest it. But if their heart is not like that of others, they do not know to detest it. And this is what is called not knowing priorities. Now, the fourth finger is traditionally considered to be without a particular purpose. It's literally called the nameless finger in Chinese. And in medical terms, this condition of the finger that will not straighten is called the trigger finger. Mencius describes the finger as being bent. It's not painful, doesn't pose difficulties, stop the person from going about their daily life. But the person is concerned enough to go to great lengths to seek the cosmetic surgery to correct this physical condition. You think, fair enough. But the idea here is that people feel ashamed if one finger is different from others and go to great lengths to correct this physical condition. But if a person's heart, as we saw before, it's a very critical part of ourselves. If a person's heart is not as good as others, they may not know or do anything about it. That's most unfortunate, because the heart actually determines our every thought. Its job is to think and reflect. It determines our every interaction with others. And so you could say that it is the most important thing to correct. It's also probably the nearest thing to correct, because we don't need to go to find a particular specialist, travel anywhere to find this doctor. But unfortunately, people often neglect to do so. So Mencius is telling us that in attending to the trivial and neglecting the important, and worrying about a finger and overlooking our heart, people don't have their priorities in the right order. And we have to try to prioritize what really matters and not be distracted from those priorities. So I think I'll end on that note today. We can see that Mencius tells us that the capacity for virtue is innate to all human beings, but it must be cultivated and developed. And we haven't gotten into the details of how to go about doing that, but it's something that we certainly have to be aware of and work on with conscious and consistent effort. Now, how do we develop and cultivate our moral sprouts? Well, the Mencius offers specific guidance and advice on that subject. And as you will have appreciated by now, it's also fairly detailed compared to the other, of the other four books, the Highest Learning, the Analects, and the Practice of the Me. So not surprisingly, it's also the longest of the four books. But the upside is that the textual details that we have in the Mencius helps to make Mencius's recommendations easier for us to understand and relate to. So I look forward to sharing with you Mencius's tips on cultivating and growing our moral sprouts next week. Thank you very much.